For over a century, scientists keep running into an uncomfortable question. How far down does learning go? Does learning require a brain, or could a nervous system be enough? Could an organism with no neurons still learn from experience? Or how about a single cell? And then the question can get even deeper. Could a physical material be trained? Can a system that is not alive change through repeated experience in a way that makes its future response different? These questions are the focus of this episode. We will follow the evidence down level by level until the familiar idea of learning starts to look much older, stranger, and more inorganic than we usually imagine. To begin, let's look at what counts as learning. Learning at first sounds like a simple word, but the closer you look, the less simple it becomes. A person can learn a language, an animal can learn to avoid danger, a cell can adjust its response after repeated stimulation. And in some cases, even a physical system can become trained. So, for this episode, we need a definition that can travel across these levels. Here, learning will not mean one identical process happening everywhere. It will mean a pattern we can look for across different systems and different scales, where past experience changes the internal state of a system, where that changed state alters the system's response in the future. That definition has three parts. First, there has to be an experience. The system has to encounter something, whether it be a signal, a stimulus, a force, or a repeated condition. Second, something inside the system has to change. That change might be neural, cellular, chemical, electrical, structural, or mechanical. Third, the change has to matter later. The system has to respond differently because of what happened before. That is why a simple reflex is not enough. A reflex can happen instantly without the system being changed by experience. Fatigue is not enough either. A system can stop responding because it is depleted, damaged, or worn out. But learning requires a more specific kind of change. The past has to leave a mark in the system in a way that shapes the next response. Now that we have our definition in hand, if we want to know how far down learning can go, we have to start taking the usual assumptions apart one at a time, starting with the brain. Can an organism show learning without a centralized brain? One of the clearest recent examples comes from the Caribbean box jellyfish, Tripodelia cystophora. This animal does not have a conventional brain. Instead, it has four sensory structures called rhopalia, each with eyes and a small visual processing center. In this species, each rhopalium has a nervous system with about 1,000 processing neurons. In its natural environment, the jellyfish faces a problem where experience matters. It lives among mangrove roots, where it has to swim close enough to forage without colliding with the roots around it. In the lab, researchers recreated that problem using visual patterns that mimicked obstacles in its habitat. When the obstacles were low contrast, the jellyfish collided more often, but after repeated experience, its behavior changed. It began avoiding the obstacles earlier. They used a combination of visual cues and mechanical feedback from previous collisions to achieve this. The authors describe this as associative learning, specifically operant conditioning. And the most important detail is that researchers could train an isolated rhopalium too. A rhopalium is not a whole jellyfish. It is one of the small sensory structures that carries the jellyfish's eyes and visual processing center. Researchers isolated one of these structures and presented visual stimuli paired with weak electrical pulses. After training, the rhopalium changed its pacemaker activity, which is tied to the jellyfish's swimming behavior. In other words, even separated from the rest of the animal, this tiny visual nervous center could still be conditioned. This suggests the learning did not require a centralized brain. It could happen inside a small sensory system with about 1,000 processing neurons. A supporting example comes from the sea anemone Nematostelia vectensis. I tried my best. Sea anemones do not have a centralized brain either. They have a nerve net. In a 2023 study, researchers paired light with a brief low-amplitude electric shock. After training, the animals responded to light alone, suggesting they had learned the association between the two events. So, this first step moves learning away from the kind of brain we usually imagine. But in those examples, there was still a nervous system. The jellyfish had ropalia, the sea anemone had a nerve net. So, the next assumption to take apart is quite obvious. Can experience change future behavior when there are no neurons at all? This is where the slime mold enters the story. The organism is Physarum polycephalum, a yellow spreading slime mold that is technically a single cell, but not in the way most of us picture. In its active stage, it can grow into a large multinucleate living network, sometimes covering a few square meters with many nuclei moving through its cytoplasm. It has no brain, no neurons, so no nervous system, but it can still move through its environment, explore, avoid unpleasant substances, and reorganize its body across space. In one experiment, researchers were not trying to prove that a slime mold could think. They were testing something much simpler and more measurable. Could Physarum habituate? Habituation is one of the simplest forms of learning. It happens when a response decreases after repeated exposure to a stimulus that turns out to be irrelevant or harmless. So the researchers gave Physarum repeated encounters with substances it normally avoids, including caffeine and quinine. The setup was simple. The slime mold had to cross a bridge to reach food. Sometimes that bridge contained a repellent, something the slime mold would normally avoid. At first, the slime mold crossed more slowly, but after repeated exposure, its behavior changed. It began crossing the treated bridge faster, as if the repeated experience had changed how strongly it avoided the substance. The important point is that the researchers were not just looking for a weaker response. They had to ask whether this was really habituation or whether the slime mold was simply exhausted, damaged, or unable to sense the substance anymore. So they tested for recovery. When the repellent was withheld for a period of time, the original avoidance response came back. They also tested stimulus specificity. A slime mold habituated to one substance could still respond to a different repellent. That matters because it helps rule out simple fatigue or general sensory dulling. A later slime mold study pushed this even further. Researchers habituated Physarum to salt and let it enter a dormant stage called sclerotium. When the slime mold was revived after a month, it still showed the habituated response. Chemical analysis suggested that sodium had been retained through dormancy, and the authors described it as a possible circulating memory. Here we saw learning below the nervous system entirely. No brains, no neurons, and still repeated experience change future behavior. It seems that learning is not something neurons invented from nothing. Neurons may be just one way life organizes learning, but they may not be the only way. Before we leave the living systems and move into matter, there is one more biological example worth seeing up close. That brings us to Stentor ceruleus, a giant single-celled organism shaped almost like a tiny trumpet. When it is undisturbed, it extends outward from a surface, pulling food inward through rows of beating cilia. But when something disturbs it, the stentor does something dramatic. It contracts. The whole cell rapidly pulls itself into a compact shape, then slowly extends again. That contraction gives researchers a simple behavior to measure. Does the cell respond or does it not? In a 2023 study, researchers used an automated device to repeatedly deliver calibrated mechanical stimuli to stentor cells. At first, the cells contracted in response, but after the same stimulus was repeated again and again, many of the cells stopped responding as often. They had habituated. And this is where the distinction from fatigue matters. The cells were not simply worn out. Earlier work in the 2023 paper emphasized that habituated stentor cells can still respond to stronger stimuli, which argues against the idea that the contraction machinery is just exhausted. But the most interesting finding came when researchers tracked individual cells. From the outside, a population of cells can look like it is gradually responding less and less. But when researchers looked closer, they found individual stentor cells seemed to have switched from a responsive state to a less responsive state. Not a smooth fade, more like a step. A tiny living system moved from I respond to this to I no longer respond to this as much. A later 2025 paper pushed the mechanism further. The authors proposed a receptor and activation model where repeated mechanical stimulation changes the availability of the cell's mechanoreceptors. In that model, activated receptors can be internalized, recycled, or degraded, changing how the cell responds to future stimulation. This example shows that we do not need to imagine a little brain inside the cell. It can be carried in the cell's sensory machinery, membrane response, receptor state, or biochemical organization. So far, we have seen simple forms of learning without brains or nerves. But after this point, the question changes. Can matter do the same? Honestly, maybe this is where the descent stops. Maybe learning, even in its simplest form, still requires something only living systems do. A living cell is capable of sensing its environment. It regulates itself, it uses energy, it repairs, it maintains a boundary between itself and the world. A physical material does not do those things in the same way. But if learning involves a past changing a system so that its future response becomes different, then we have to ask a more basic question first. Can the physical world carry the past forward at all? The answer is yes. A material does not always respond only to what is happening in the present. Sometimes its current response depends on what has already happened to it. You can see this in hysteresis, where a system does not simply respond to the present condition in isolation. Its response depends on the path it took to get there. A magnetic material, for example, can retain some influence of how it was magnetized before, and some elastic materials do not retrace the exact same path after being stretched and released. In both cases, the past is not gone. It is part of the system's present state. And you can also see this in memristors, electrical components whose resistance depends on previous electrical activity. In an ordinary resistor, resistance is treated as fixed. In a memristor, the past current or voltage can change the resistance itself. So the device's present behavior carries an electrical history. None of that is automatically learning, but these examples show something important. The past can become physically built into a system. And that matters because without some form of history dependence, learning has nowhere to live. This is where newer physical learning research enters the picture. In a 2023 review called Learning Without Neurons in Physical Systems, Menachem Stern and Arvind Murugan together describe an emerging framework called physical learning. The review is not one single experiment. It's more like a map of a field that is starting to form. Their central idea is that learning does not have to be limited to brains, neurons, or software. A physical system can, in principle, learn if it has parts that respond to the world, parts that can change, and a rule that modifies those changeable parts based on what the system experiences. This framework matters because in a normal design process, a material is often designed from the top down. A researcher decides the structure, calculates what it should do, builds it, tests it, and then adjusts the design. Physical learning, though, imagines something different. Instead of fully designing the solution in advance, the system is exposed to examples of the behavior it needs to perform. Then the physical system responds. Its own internal features are modified based on that response. Over time, the system can move toward the desired behavior. Stern and Murugan describe several places where this idea is being explored. One direction is mechanical materials, where stiffness, rest length, geometry, or elastic structure can change their training. Another is flow networks, where the structure of a network can adapt so that fluid moves through it in a desired way. And then there is molecular self-assembly, where interactions between molecular components could be adjusted so that the system assembles into target structures more reliably. What ties these examples together is that learning is being treated as a physical process. The system has a response. The system has changeable internal features, and those features are altered by training. That is going from passive history to physical learning. A material with hysteresis carries a past state. A memristor can carry electrical history. But physical learning asks whether those kinds of physical changes can be organized into something more directed, a system adapting toward a function. It does not prove that ordinary matter learns like an organism. It does not erase the difference between a cell and a circuit. But it does show that researchers are taking seriously the possibility that learning can be implemented in physical systems through local changes distributed across the system itself. And the practical reason is just as important as the philosophical one. A system that learns physically may not need a perfect computer model of itself. It can be trained through real use with all the imperfections of the actual material included. That could matter for adaptive materials, low power computing, neuromorphic hardware, and devices that need to keep adapting after they are built. This is not settled science yet, but the direction is real, and scientists are asking whether learning can be built into matter's own dynamics. So, how far down does the learning go? The honest answer is that it depends on what kind of learning we mean. We saw associative learning in animals without centralized brains. We saw habituation in organisms with no neurons at all. We saw a single cell change its future response after repeated stimulation. And then at the boundary of life itself, we saw matter can carry history and physical systems can be shaped by what happened before. So the deepest version of the question may not be where learning begins or how deep it goes. It may be where the past first starts to matter, where experience leaves a trace, and where the next response is no longer quite the same. I can't wait to hear your thoughts on all of this. And until next time, stay curious and take care.